Good morning, everybody. My name is Pete. I'm one of the pastors here, and if you're joining us, if you maybe were with us at Creekside of the movies, and you're here, and this is like one of your first times here, we're so glad that you're here with us. So glad that you're joining in Kitchener, in Chatham, and Westside, and online for this new series. It's going to be an 8-week series called A Whole New World. Little preamble. Some sermons don't have introductions because I only have like 33 minutes. And so I just take the introduction out. So here's the introduction to today's sermon. I have a daughter, and she's young, and she's in the service right now. And I said to her, I think today's sermon is going to be really boring. And she said, well, at least it won't be scary like last week. Because last week we were watching Dune 2, and it was scary. Okay, so I tell you that there's a lot of teaching, and there's a lot of talking, and there's a lot of, are you going to tell any jokes? And probably not, okay, today? So if you're here to learn something about Genesis, we're going to be in Genesis chapter 1, and I hope that you're going to find some things useful and fresh and engaging. But this is what I would call like a lean-in sermon. All right, some sermons I'm like, I'm going to get you. It doesn't matter how much attention you give me, I'm going to take it. Today, if you don't lean in, if you don't want it, you're not going to get it, okay? So, this series, we're walking through the book of Genesis. We're going to get to maybe the first 8 chapters, kind of Noah and a little bit beyond Noah. And today we're looking at Genesis chapter 1. But before we begin in Genesis chapter 1, we got some work to do. So the first thing is this. You may have heard of Genesis before, and you may have heard, maybe like in a coffee shop somewhere, other people debating the book of Genesis. Genesis creates a lot of debates. A lot of, just how true is this? Just how scientific is this? And what I'm going to try to do in this series is tap dance through all those laser beams and avoid all those questions. And instead, here's how I want to treat Genesis. I want to look at Genesis as theology. Genesis is primarily recorded and passed down over the centuries for us to teach us something about God. I want to look at Genesis as the first book in the library of books that we call the Bible. So there are themes and ideas and characters in the book of Genesis that are important to learn to build a foundation for understanding the rest of the Bible. And so throughout this series and in your small groups as well, you're going to notice that we're going to be looking at these themes on Sunday from Genesis, and then you're going to look at how that carries through the Old Testament and eventually gets to Jesus, and how that theme that began in Genesis gets carried through the rest of the Bible. So Genesis as theology, as the first book, and then this morning we're going to look at it primarily as worldview shaping. Worldview shaping. Everybody has a worldview, whether you know it like explicitly and you could explain it, or it's just something that you hold implicitly. Everyone has a way of making sense of the world. A lens through which you see the world that answers questions like, who am I? Where are we? Where do we come from? Who put us here? Is there a who put us here? Are there many who's who put us here? Answers questions like, what is the purpose of life? Everybody has a worldview, and it seems like since the most beginning ancient civilizations of humanity, people have used stories to be able to make sense of the world and to shape their worldviews. So before we get to Genesis this morning, I want us to do a little bit of imagining. Imagine that you lived 3,000 to 4,000 years ago. Okay, there's no Google, or lights, or food in the refrigerator. 3,000 to 4,000 years ago, in ancient Near Eastern empires, you've probably heard of the Egyptian Empire, the Babylonian Empire, the Canaanite Empire. Imagine living in those empires. They had what we call ancient Near Eastern creation narratives. They had their own stories that they told to help them make sense of, where did we come from? Who are we? What are we doing here? Who are the gods or God? And what do we make of all of this? They had their own stories that shaped their worldview. And I want to share with you a couple of them. The first one, we're going to read a piece of it. It's from the Egyptian Empire. And we're just going to read a little portion of it. It's going to feel weird to read because it's got language and ideas that we're unfamiliar with. But just to get you familiar with this idea that like there was a people group 3,000-4,000 years ago. And they used this story to derive meaning that helped them understand their place in the world and where we come from. The waters speak. I am the waters, unique without second. In the beginning of this creation narrative, we have this chaotic waters. There is nothing except for these waters, and these waters speak. And then a character emerges, Atum, and now he speaks. That is where I evolved on the great occasion of my float. I, Atum, the creator, am the one who once evolved. In the beginning, there were these waters, and then Atum evolves out of them, and he becomes the creator. Circlet, who is in his egg. It seems like this is him in his egg form before he fully evolved out of the waters. I am the one who began therein, in the waters. See, the flood is subtracted from me. See, I am the remainder. There's this idea of separation, that there was the waters and then Atum separates himself out. I made my body evolve through my own effectiveness. I am the one who made me. I built myself as I wished, according to my heart. And then this Atum who comes from the waters, he evolves into another god, into the greatest of the gods, and he begins creating more gods and creates like a whole pantheon of gods. This is one of the ways that ancient Egyptian people would make sense of their world. Where did we come from? Well, it all began in like a chaotic kind of watery space, and then one god emerged, evolved, pulled himself out of that, and then he created more gods, and then eventually those gods create humanity. And they're all ordering the world and creating the world. They're all bringing order of some sort from this beginning chaotic, watery mess. There seems to be an emphasis on this idea of like, the God like created himself, pulled himself up. And so I'd imagine if maybe you had a centering story, a narrative like this, perhaps you would begin to form a worldview where I need to do the same thing. I need to pull myself up. I need to create on my own. I need to make myself and then make the world around me. Maybe a story like that begins to shape the way you see the world and think of yourself. Another more famous creation narrative that existed for these ancient Near Eastern people is a Babylonian creation narrative called the Enuma Elish. And instead of reading it, I'm just going to give you this Cole's note because it's wild and crazy. And I want to tell you the wild and crazy parts and ignore the parts that are confusing and boring. So, in the beginning, there are once again these chaotic waters, and there is darkness. But from the waters separate out these two gods, a saltwater god and a freshwater god. And these two gods, one of them named Tiamat, they eventually begin to create more gods. And so what emerges is that there are these older gods, these two older gods, and then this new upstart group of young gods. And eventually the older gods begin to war with the younger gods. And among the younger gods, one god emerges. His name is Marduk, and he has lots of power. And this war begins to rage, and eventually two of the older gods, of the two, one of them is killed, which makes Tiamat very angry, and she decides, I am going to raise up a whole bunch of sea monsters. Reminds me of like Mighty Morphin Power Rangers. You know how they used to like create those monsters and then send them down like Godzilla on the earth? It's like she begins to create all these sea monsters, and she's going to go to war with all of the younger gods to wipe them out. But Marduk has lots of power. And over this battle between Tiamat and Marduk, Marduk wins. And in this victory, takes Tiamat, rips her in half, and from the two pieces creates the heavens and the earth. And then takes one of her champions, one of these creatures that she created, and from his blood creates humanity to be the servants, maybe to go as far as even to say the slaves of the gods. And for the ancient Babylonians, this was their creation narrative. This is where the world came from. This is how we thought about the origins of life. This is how we thought about who we are as people. We were created from the blood of this God, created to serve, be the servants of the gods. Imagine what that was like. To have heard that as a child, this is our story. This is where we came from. This is our creation narrative. How that would have shaped your thinking. How it would have formed a worldview. Worldviews ask questions like this. Creation, where did it come from? It came from a violent conflict between some gods and some other spiritual realm. It came from their battle. That's how we ended up here. Who are we? We're slaves. We're servants of these gods. We're like trapped here, and we just have to try to keep the gods on our side. What kind of world is this? This is a world that is constantly in flux. This is a world that has some order to it, but there's some other space where there's gods who are apparently constantly at war with one another. And so the world is constantly in flux. Imagine the type of stress that would create on a human. It's a world where everything is a god. The sun is a god, the moon is a god, the trees are gods, the grass is gods. And all of these gods need to be pleased by sacrifices. How do I keep these gods on my side? Hopefully I know all the right ones and I do all the right things so that these gods will help me grow my crops and keep my family healthy. Expectations for life. I hope to get by. The purpose of life is to one day escape this material world, this trap here, and to get outside of it. Imagine what that would feel like to have this as your ongoing narrative in your mind. There are gods. They tend to be fickle and angry, and they are at war, and I am but a servant of them, created from some violent battle from the blood of some other defeated god. It is in this ancient Near Eastern context that Genesis 1 emerges. That Genesis 1 becomes another creation narrative that begins to illuminate and subvert the other creation narratives of the people around them. Imagine being an ancient Israelite, and you know Genesis 1. You were raised on, you memorized it when you were 6 years old. It's in your blood, and you meet a Babylonian who for some reason doesn't want to kill you. And so you begin a conversation. We have a creation narrative. You have a creation. Let's compare, and perhaps they want to know yours. And so you begin to tell them about your creation narrative, and you begin to tell them about Genesis 1, and you begin to read, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. In the actual Hebrew, God's name here is Elohim. And it would probably be better to translate heavens and earth as skies and the land, because these Hebrew words for the rest of chapter 1 get interpreted as skies and the land. And so you say to this Babylonian friend of yours, in the beginning, Elohim created the skies and the land. And they would have said, just one God? Where did he come from? We don't know. It's a bit of a mystery where he came from. He seems to have just always existed, but our story doesn't have that. Just in the beginning, there is one God, and he creates. He creates. Just how does he create? Well, we'll get to that. But there's just one God? One? Really? You're like, yeah. Okay, what comes next? Well, now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters, to which your Babylonian friend would say, oh, I've heard of that. I've heard of the chaos waters. I've heard of that idea that in the beginning there was just like chaotic waters, like a stormy sea, and there was darkness. And so there would have been some familiarity. Oh yeah, that's our story begins that way too. Okay, what comes next? What comes next? And God said, let there be light. And there was light. He just says it? Who do you have to fight to make the light? He didn't have to fight anybody. He didn't have to like rip apart somebody and pull their heart out and make it into a light bulb or anything. No, he just speaks. The God of our story, there's only one, and he just speaks things into existence. Wow, this is different. And God saw that the light was good. This story's good. Creation is good. Oh yeah, that's going to be a theme. We're going to say that over and over and over as you read through chapter 1. It's good. It's good. It's good. There is this constant refrain, this drumbeat of creation being good. And for people who grew up with a story where creation was more like a trap, the result of a violent battle, we were created from the blood of some defeated God, monster thing. This language is fresh, and it begins to create a whole new world for people who choose to live under this story. It was good, and he separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. Hopefully you can see what this would have felt like to exist in a culture where that empire has that creation narrative, and our fledgling new group, we have our own creation narrative. How that would have shaped them. And it's not that they copied from the groups around them, but think of it as there were themes that you would include in a creation narrative. And so they include those themes to either use them in a similar way, chaotic waters, or to then subvert them. And by subverting them and saying something new, while you hold it up against two different creation narratives, it had a new power to it. It was clear that you were saying something new. Every story I've ever heard had lots of gods, lots of battle, lots of struggle, and this one just has one God. It's meant to speak something new, create a whole new world. And if you were to this week begin to study Genesis 1, I would hope that you would begin to see that there is an order within the chapter itself. That if you were aided by a study aid of some kind, if you broke open a commentary, you'd start to see that there is beauty within this chapter that speaks of the beauty of the world. It's meta, for those of you that know what that is. Something that is aware of itself. It's like it can be outside of itself and point to something within itself. It's like it's not just talking about beauty, it is beautifully structured itself. And so if you were to start to study it, you'd start to notice things like, in verse 2 here, we had problems or obstacles with the chaos that was emerging. There was the earth was formless and void, and there's darkness, and there are these chaotic waters. There's three kind of obstacles to God, and then on day 1, God deals with the darkness, and he separates out and creates light. And then on day 2, he deals with the waters, and he separates out the waters. And he separates the waters in order to create this space where humans can live. And so there's waters above and waters below. But he deals with the problem of the chaotic waters. And then on day 3, land emerges from the waters. So the things mentioned in verse 2 then become the themes of day 1, day 2, and day 3. If you were to fold these days down the middle, you'd notice that day 1, 2, and 3 all have this sort of container aspect to them. They all kind of create spaces, create like the heavens on day 1. And then on day 4, sun, moon, and stars. So a container is created and then God fills them. On day 2, we create the waters above and the waters below, and then on day 5, God fills it with creatures. And then on day 3, we create the land, and on day 6, the creatures of the land, and eventually human beings. There is a beautiful order to this chapter as you study it. There is repetition. There is God constantly separates out, calls things out, and then names them. He says he's going to do things, and then he does them. And there is a refrain, like I mentioned before, of, and these are good, and it's good, and it's good. And when we get to the creation of humans on day 6, we start to see even more of the contrast between this creation narrative and the ones of the surrounding cultures. Well, actually, wait, before we get to that, there's this part where God makes the sun and the moon. It says, and God said, let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night. And let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light to the earth. And it was so. God made 2 great lights, the greater light to govern the day and the lesser light to govern the night. Greater light and lesser light? Why not just say sun and moon? Do we not know sun and moon? 3,000, 4,000 years ago, we don't know about the sun and the moon. What's going on here? Some people think that the reason for this language is because other creation narratives would have had the sun and the moon be gods of their own. And so in some creation narratives, those are entities, the personalities, forces. And in this one, they're just lamps. There's a big lamp and a little lamp. This is ancient trash talk. This is like, oh, the sun god. Oh, you mean the big lamp? You see how different that is? People worshiped the sun, sacrificed to the sun, lived in fear of the sun. And a story comes along and says, oh, the big lamp? You got to make a decision. Which one is it? Is it a big lamp or is it to be feared and worshiped? These narratives create worlds all their own for people. And so we get language like this, and it's beautiful internally, and it speaks of the beauty of creation. And then we get to the creation of human beings on day 6. Then God said, let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and all the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created the male and female. He created them image, image, image. 3 times created in God's image so that you don't miss it. You were not created by accident or from some cosmic battle, from the blood of some other God. You were created on purpose to be a reflection of who God is. Made to be like him, given characteristics that he has. He creates, you can create too. And then God, in his benevolence, God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and increase in number, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, and over every living creature that moves on the ground. God just created everything, and what does he do? He starts to give it away. I made this for you. You go now and rule it and subdue it and create order and beauty from it. And then God said, I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seed in it, they will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and all the birds in the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give. Every green plant for food, he gives, he gives, he gives. And it was so. And God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Good, good. It's a double good. On day 6, after the creation of humans, it's double good. What does God think about double good? I was making, and I was like, this is so good. It's so beautiful. It's so, but this that I just made that bears my image, good, good. And there was evening, there was morning, the 6th day. And then we get another difference between this God on the 7th day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. And by the 7th day, God had finished the work that he had been doing. And so on the 7th day, he rested from all his work. And then God blessed the 7th day and made it holy because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. If you're an ancient Babylonian and you hear of this God, what might you ask after hearing this? He rested. Wasn't he worried? Wasn't he worried that if he rested, some other God, some upstart God might take his throne? In those narratives, there is no rest. There is only stress and constant battle for power and control. And this story comes along and says, after this God effortlessly speaks creation into existence, he also can rest. Maybe if I start to live under this story of the world, maybe I could find some rest. Maybe this God who created me in his image, created me to also experience times of rest as well. What kind of worldview does Genesis 1 create for us? A couple questions. Origin, where do we come from? From a God who's just out of the overflow of his creativity and his love with no need to create, just creates. Who are we? We are the image bearers of God. What kind of world is this? Good. What about me? Good, good. What kind of expectations, what kind of purpose do I have for my life? Well, I guess if this world is good and it was created by a God who was bringing order from chaos and beauty and light from darkness, I guess if I'm made in his image, I do the same thing. I find places of chaos and I order them. And I find places where there's darkness and I bring light to them. All the while having times where I'm invited to rest from my work, seeing all of creation as good and as a gift given to me. Do you see how different an ancient Near Eastern creation narrative is from Genesis 1? Genesis 1 would have come as such a gift, as such a liberating gift to people, to reframe how they think about themselves and about God and life itself. This is only chapter 1 of Genesis. Now you may know that in the coming weeks, this story is going to take a turn for the worse. Hope that doesn't come as a surprise to you. Things like sin will enter into this story, and through sin, death will enter into this story. But for the sake of today, here's how I want you to think of it. Think of it as God creates a world where he pushes back the darkness and he orders the chaos waters and he instructs his image bearers, continue to do that. And go and be fruitful and multiply, making good and beautiful things in the world. And at some point along the way, those humans decide, we're going to invite darkness back in. We're going to invite chaos back in. And you find that throughout the rest of the Bible, those themes of darkness and light, and water and chaos and order are everywhere. And you find that as the first Christians begin to tell the story of Jesus, that they pick up on these themes that they would have memorized from when they were little children, from Genesis 1. And when they speak of what Jesus is doing and what God is doing in the world through Jesus, they will use that same language to describe what Jesus is doing. John, who is the one that Jesus loved, sometimes I think of him as like he's Jesus' best friend, or at least he thought he was. When he writes his gospel, in the first chapter of his gospel, he starts it this way: in the beginning, which is him saying to anybody who's read Genesis 1, I'm trying to make a comparison here. I'm trying to bring some themes together here. Like, you should read that and go, oh, before I read any further, I should go read Genesis 1 over again. But we don't have time for that right now. But in the beginning was the Word. And the Word was God, was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. And through him, all things were made. Without him, nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all mankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a beginning when there was darkness, and God brought light into that darkness. Humans invited that darkness back into the world, and God shows up in the person of Jesus as light once again to push back the darkness. Later in the book of John, we'll see Jesus on the sea, and a storm comes. Imagine the storm creating this dark, chaotic feel. Suddenly, we are transported back in our imaginations to Genesis 1, the chaotic waters at the beginning. And what does Jesus do in this moment? He speaks. Just like in Genesis 1, God speaks. Jesus, peace, be still. And the chaos is calmed. We're meant to see that this God who is active in Genesis 1 is returning in a new way in this person that we call Jesus. And so what if you begin to try on this worldview that begins in Genesis 1 and then tracks all the way to Jesus? What would it be like to try that on? I think of it this way, that maybe if you have times in your life where you feel depressed, you have times where you're like, I can't look at the news anymore. I can't scroll past one more article. Like the world seems crazy. My friends seem crazy. You feel like if you just feel low, that you go back to this worldview and you begin to tell yourself and remind yourself things like, I know it seems crazy, but fundamentally it is good. There is goodness here. When you feel like your own self, your own body betrays you, your mind betrays you, I feel like there's no good in me. You remember that on the sixth day, God said, good, good. When it feels like life has become this chaotic water around you and you feel like maybe you're drowning, it feels like God, for some people, he's holding everything at bay, but for me, he's just letting the floods come in. And there's things that I hoped for, there's things that I was looking forward to, and I lost them. There's people that I loved and I lost them. There's the dream I had of retirement and the diagnosis just came back and it's cancer. And it feels like the darkness is pushing in on me. What do I do? When you have this worldview, you appeal to the one who speaks to the darkness and speaks light into that darkness, who brings light from darkness, who brings order from chaos, beauty from ashes. You appeal to that one. There is no, maybe God's against me, maybe I'm not good, no. God sees you as his image bearer. There is good in you. You appeal to him, the one who created in the beginning to keep creating. Sometimes to carry you through those waters, but to be with you. In the beginning, the Spirit hovers over the waters. Maybe when you live in this worldview, sometimes you invite the Spirit of Jesus to hover over you. It feels like my life is chaotic right now. Spirit of God, would you come hover over me? And better than that, would you come indwell me and be with me through this chaotic, dark time? When you have this worldview, you get a unique hope. And I want to end here in Colossians chapter 1, where Paul's writing a letter to the church in Colossae. And I want you to notice what he does in chapter 1. And hopefully before I say it, you'll notice what he's doing. But you might miss it, so I'll explain it. But in chapter 1, he says this: the Son is the image of the invisible God. In the beginning, we have an invisible God creating. But now that God has stepped into the visible creation. We call him the Son. We call him Jesus, the firstborn over all creation. For in him, all things were created, things in heaven and on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities, all things have been created through him and for him. He's before all things, and in him all things hold together. What did Paul just do? Paul just wrote a new character into the story everybody knew since they were little kids. Paul just took Genesis 1 and said there was another person there that you guys didn't know about. He's the Son. We call him Jesus. And you thought it was just Elohim holding all things, creating all things. No. All things were created in and through and held together by this new character on the scene, Jesus of Nazareth, Jesus the Christ. This would be wild to read this. This would be as wild as me getting up one day and going, there's a fourth member of the Godhead. You'd be like, what? This is wild. And then look what he does next. He, Jesus, is the head of the body, the church. He's the beginning and the firstborn from among the dead, so that in everything he might have the supremacy. What did Paul just do? He invoked the first creation, and he says Jesus was there at that first creation. In him and through him, all things were made and hold together. And then he jumps forward to our time and says, and through his resurrection, he's creating again. In the church, Jesus is at work creating a whole new humanity. This worldview, when you see that Jesus was there in the beginning and he is the key to the recreation of the world, to the redemption of the world, it's crazy. And there's this beauty that begins to emerge from the Bible beyond all of the debates. And so if you've been turned off from the Bible or Christianity because of Genesis 1 problems, I hope that today you can start to see the whole new world that was created when Genesis 1 began to be spoken and heard by the people that were repeating it over and over, the whole new world that was created. And if you've been turned off of the Bible, I hope that this series will begin to open you up to these themes and this repetition and these patterns. And you'll find that it's like the Bible has this whole new world in it that you never knew existed. Let me pray, and then we'll go. Jesus, help us to believe that creation is good, that it is good to be human. We're broken, we're messed up, yeah, but fundamentally, it's good. We're not trying to escape it. We're trying to step into what it means to fully be human. Jesus, for those of us who are surrounded by darkness today or tomorrow, may your Spirit be so tangibly present with us. Even right now as we breathe, Spirit, hover over us. Bring us peace. Bring us the rest that only you can bring, because you are the only true God, uncontested. Jesus, we love you. We love your church. Help us to be your people, inviting people into a church that is like a whole new world. It's like, man, I was part of something that was broken and chaotic, and I'm coming into this new world with these Christians, and it's like God is at work remaking things. God, may that be people's experience of being around us in our community. Jesus, help us to be like you. Pray these things to God our Father. In the name of Jesus, amen.